This is a show about a promise.
Oh, you can turn this into a job. You can guarantee yourself making money. You can go from being an everyman to a spectacular multimillionaire overnight.
And it's a promise that has become ubiquitous.
I'm stunned, if that's more interesting, about how fast it happened, about the quote, velocity of uptake of the different types of options that any person in America could get into on their phone in the privacy of their own homes.
What happens to a culture that very quickly gets engulfed by betting, by wagering, by gambling?
It was his college savings account that had been saved by his parents and his grandparents, bar mitzvah money, birthdays, the whole thing. For families that are fortunate to do that, that's a number that's not uncommon, 180,000. But in a year and a half, it was all gone.
Welcome to It Turns Out. I'm Kara Miller. One of the most striking stories I've heard recently comes from a guy who makes bets for a living. He goes by the name of Domer, and he bets on all sorts of world events on this site called Polymarket, which bills itself as the world's largest prediction market. One of his bets, and this was a huge win, was that President Trump would choose JD Vance as his running mate in 2024. CBS's 60 Minutes asked him, why'd he choose Vance?
So that goes back to 2016 when he picked Mike Pence. And buried in one of the articles for why he picked Mike Pence is that Mike Pence had a one-syllable name. And Trump has a one-syllable name. And Trump is very into marketing. And so I was looking at the names and I was like, who is one syllable? And not only is Vance one syllable, he's only 2 letters off of Pence.
To me, that answer was both kind of hilarious and breathtaking. 60 Minutes reported that he turned a $4,000 bet into $250,000. Of course, bets don't always go by the name bet. Sometimes they're wagers, sometimes in financial markets they're contracts. But those may be distinctions without a difference.
What does it feel like to be a person, to take money from wherever source, download it onto one of these apps, and then put that money on the app into a contract, a bet, or a wager? It feels identical. And what does it feel like when that bet loses or when that bet wins? It's going to feel identical, whether you're betting on roulette or you're entering a contract on the election.
Timothy Fong is a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, and he's the co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies Program. And he has watched as gambling, betting, contracts, they have washed over America. There are apps meant to make short-term stock trading more fun and easier. There are these prediction sites like Polymarket. And then, of course, there's sports betting.
I think the journey in my career kind of mirrors what we went through as an American. I'm a firm Generation X physician. So I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. And for a long time, gambling was viewed as a destination, a quiet, behind closed door, an adults-only activity. Then we started to see the normalization of gambling in the late 90s with gambling as a destination resort, as a family activity. Then we saw, of course, the poker boom and the internet. Now, in 2026, American society views gambling as a normalized and an expected part of American culture. That part, I think, is shocking. The idea that young men and women who were born in 2000, say during the pandemic, are now entering, into childhood with the expectation that you're supposed to bet on sports. Not with the you can bet on sports, but instead you're supposed to. So when you normalize any sort of activity, you do what? You decrease perception of harm. You increase kind of just its penetration in everything. It's literally in the water. It's in the food. It's in the air. It's in every branded message you consume on TV, social media, internet, books, magazine. It's all part of the fabric. And I think that's a really interesting part of our work and understanding the impact that gambling has on body, brain, mind, spirit, and wallets.
For people who run gambling or betting companies, it's been a bonanza. The founders of DraftKings, Betfred, Fanatics, these people have hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. It's been a kind of redistribution of wealth to the top. But the wins have not come without losses.
We know that in every state in America, we have more calls to gambling helplines than ever before. And these are not the helplines about, hey, I lost my password or how do I cash out? These are the helplines with stories of, I'm suicidal, or I lost a lot of money and I don't know how to tell my parents, or I feel terrible, real stories of human misery. But that's a marker of signs of increase in problems throughout America.
Fong says something like 1 to 3% of people have a gambling addiction, which may not seem like very many people, but if 2% of adult Americans have a gambling problem, you're looking at more than 5 million people. And he says for each person who has a gambling problem, something like 8 or 9 people are adversely affected. Well, now you're starting to look at 40 or 50 million Americans, and gambling, it keeps on spreading.
There is a growing concern that number, 1 to 3% of people developing gambling disorder, is rising. And it's rising because there are simply more ways to gamble. We learned that from the opioid crisis in the late 90s and early 2000s. You had more opiates out there available at cheaper, faster, and more potent forms. You develop more addiction. It's just math. I think the same thing holds true with these various products, online and brick and mortar, that could potentially create gambling addiction. When you have more products out there and you have more people starting it up, that means more people who are at risk to develop this addiction are going to be exposed to it.
Fong worries about what this is doing to society in a couple of ways.
If there's one concern I have, is a lot of these financial products, they're done in isolation. They're done by yourself. They're not done with other people. And that, when you think of this as a form of entertainment, we've created essentially solitude entertainment. We don't create networks where you're really enjoying the product together.
And then, he says, because there's so much money behind the push to get people to make bets and these industries are growing so quickly, he worries about the promise that they can help you achieve the American dream.
Oh, you can turn this into a job. You can guarantee yourself making money. You can go from being an everyman to a spectacular multimillionaire overnight. I think that's the real danger, that these products and the advertising that comes with it give an illusion of control and an illusion of spectacular success that is imminent, not rare.
That illusion can be particularly powerful for some people, even though they might be using money that they could put in a retirement account and would grow with compounded interest. So in essence, they're borrowing from their future selves.
Think about neurobiologically what $100 means to a 19-year-old versus someone in their 40s or 50s. When you're 19, everything's bigger, right? Your brain's not fully developed. You're experiencing things for the first time. So of course you're naturally drawn to rewards more intensely than, say, an older adult, which then means that you're more likely to continue to engage in that activity over and over.
Lots of Americans worry that small amounts of money just aren't going to get them anywhere, unless maybe they could double or triple those amounts.
Affordability is everywhere. Income inequality, everyone hears about it. And the promise of these gambling and financial platforms is that can lower the wage gap, or it can get rid of income inequality. It can give you, every man, a fair shake.
Gambling, betting, wagering, they've changed a lot in the last few years. But there's a saying from the kind of old school casino days that can be good to keep in the back of your mind. The house always wins.
Now, what we get into the whole discretionary spending idea is that people will now look at spending money on gambling again as I need to in order to advance my financial class, instead of saying, well, what's a reasonable amount I should spend on this experience? Again, if I'm going to a ball game, there's an upper limit to how much I'm willing to spend to go to a ball game.
Right, right.
But when it comes to investing or gambling or taking financial risks, it's taught and told you have to go hard, go heavy, strike while the iron's hot. If you miss this opportunity, this is your one chance to get in. There's a kind of a quiet desperation that then generates the likelihood that people are willing to spend more. And so we know a few things. Like I've seen some reports in credit spending credit card companies where like 5 of the top 10 companies that are being spent on are either gambling or financial risk taking platforms. We see a
Wow.
lot of
Like that's how people spend their
yeah,
money,
just where are they
their credit
spending their
card
money?
money.
You know, they're
Yeah.
not spending it at the
Okay.
opera. They're not spending it on New York Times. They're spending it on, not spending it on clothes. They're spending it on, gambling and financial platforms. But the patients that I see, I'll give you a quick case story. I
Mhm.
saw a young man about a month ago, came in first time, 19-year-old college student, very, very lovely young man, smart, intelligent, gets into a good college and got
Right.
into sports betting online from real money as a high school student through his parents, allowed through his parents. So his parents gave him the money and
Okay.
he did the thing away. Got into
Okay.
college, pledged at a frat where everyone in the frat was betting on sports and everyone in the
Okay.
frat was also investing into crypto or meme coins and doing it. So he kind of rode that wave of peer pressure and got into it and liked doing it, technologically savvy. You fast forward a year and a half later, he had spent $180,000. It was gone, not lost,
Wow.
spent. So this was
Where did
money.
that money, can I ask,
Oh, yeah,
where
it
does
was
that
his
even come
college
from? He's
savings.
a college student. I would think he had like
It was his
$20.
college savings account that had been
Okay.
saved by his
Okay.
parents and his grandparents, bar mitzvah money, birthdays, the whole thing. And
Mhm.
for families that are fortunate to do that, that's a number that's not uncommon,
Yeah.
180,000. But in a year and a half, it was all
Wow.
gone. It was all gone.
Right.
And
Right.
that's part of the addiction. And when I asked him, well, where did it go? And he's like, well, I kept chasing my losses. I
Yep.
kept hearing about new things that if I could get into, it would go 10x in a week or 20x
Right.
in one day. He told me about financial devices I've never heard of, like same day options, right? That expire at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Incredibly risky
Right.
devices that never existed in the 80s or 90s.
I was going to say, I think those things have just proliferated like crazy. Like then people understand there's a market and they create the devices.
Well, there's a demand. There's always going to be a demand for
Yes,
instant
exactly.
resolution, instant gratification. That's just human nature. If I said to you, do you want $500 today or do you want $500 20 years from now? Of course, everyone's going to say today. But if I said to you,
Yeah.
do you want $500 today or $5,000 10 years from now? Most people are going to say, give me the 5,000. But
Right.
now a lot of the younger people who are not fully grown or impulsive or the instant gratification or the people who don't believe there is going to be even a planet Earth in 10 years say, well, why would I wait for the 5,000? Give me the 500 right
Mm.
now. So we're tying
Mm.
in a lot of interesting themes, right?
Mhm.
Hopelessness and generational concern and live for the day because you don't know what's going to happen and affordability. So much I hear a lot why people turn to gambling and risky activities is I can't afford basic things. And I turn to these products as a way of getting discretionary income to be able to buy things. On the flip
Right.
side, when I challenge, I say, well, why don't you just get a job? I've had so many people say jobs are too slow. Jobs are too slow. Why should I work 6 to 8 hour shift to earn $100 and then have 20 taken out for tax for
Right.
$80 when I could make $80 in 5 seconds?
But I assume the reason that they're in your office is probably not that they've made
Right.
$50,000 on sports bets or meme coins or whatever, but more like they've lost a ton of money.
That's right.
And
And again, my experience is always going to be clouded because the time people call and make an appointment to see me, things are really, really
right,
severe. I think there's a lot of
right.
harmful consequences, a lot of terrible things. But I also get an opportunity to talk to a lot of people who aren't yet in my office, and these are some of the things that I hear. We have a 20-year-old son and a 16-year-old son, so I get to talk to some of their friends and kind of
Mhm.
hear the zeitgeist of what young people are saying and
Yeah.
doing, and that's kind of what you hear. That's a little bit of a byproduct of the pandemic when it was conceived. Oh my God, that's too dangerous to work in a coffee shop or a grocery store. Why would you put yourself at risk to be a bartender and expose yourself to all these things? Again, creating a world on the phone where you can generate income and again, potentially generate income way quicker, way faster than if you earned it. That's the key thing. You don't earn money gambling. You don't earn it by these prediction markets. You win it You are granted it, but by the actual earning it in the way that we traditionally think of, no.
But it sounds like when you talked before about people thinking, why would I go take a job with relatively low pay and long hours and get taxes taken out? Like it's not worth it.
Yeah.
It sounds like instead of using gambling or betting or prediction markets to close the gap with richer people, which is what they're hoping to do,
Right.
it sounds like often the gap gets opened up. So poorer people who think like a low-paying job is not the answer, can become even poorer.
And for years, we've seen this in gambling, traditional brick and mortar gambling,
Yes,
or the
yes.
lottery. The lottery is a perfect
Exactly, like a regressive tax,
regressive
right?
tax.
Right.
And again, if someone is spending a higher percentage of their discretionary income or their investment
Yeah.
income and they don't get it back, they're just going to fall further and further behind getting ahead. And I think about
Right.
what do people need to get ahead? They need resources, they need mentors, they need opportunities, things that if you don't have money, you can't do. I'll give you a quick example of this issue that we're looking at in terms of affordability and whatnot. If you spend all your discretionary income on gambling or investing, or it's tied up and you can't use it, you can't take advantage of local real world opportunities that might yield something. For instance, I play a lot of tennis. I play a lot of pickleball, and I play
Okay.
padel. These aren't cheap. These aren't free. And yet I've made literally hundreds of friends and social connections through playing this sport. Those social connections can easily turn into jobs, opportunities, new friends,
Right.
things I never would have predicted. I don't get those opportunities if I can't afford to do those things. And I get a lot of that from patients who, again, tons of crippling debt, no easy income to match that, viewing gambling as a way out, and then not wanting to spend money investing on other things that it feels like the payoff is going to take a long, long, long time. So you buttress all of this again, this theme of loneliness that supersedes all of this, regardless of
Yeah.
whether you're struggling with a gambling disorder or if you're just trying to make ends meet or you're just living in America. This culture of
Right.
loneliness that can be replaced by the phone, and in this case, the phone to generate income. I don't see that. I don't have hard numbers on it. It's just a sense that I have from talking to people that people then choose not to use that discretionary income, no matter what they have, to turn it into a connection or a sense of purpose or a skill. Oh, I have an
Yes.
extra $50 this week. You know what? Let me go ahead and see if I can double it or triple it. And if I can, great. If I can't, I'll just stay home and just stay on my phone for the weekend, and I'll have enough to do. So we're talking about a lot of different various arrows and points that explain certain things, but we do know, for facts, that definitely the expenditures on just gambling and financially tech platforms have definitely gone up so much. Like just from this past Super Bowl in 2026 compared to the Super Bowl in 2025, in terms of how much was entered into these prediction markets, it was like 8 times more. So, and that's not taking into account all the other traditional sports books and mobile sports betting apps. So it's not like people are making that much more money, and we know that through the wage stagnation. So therefore, something has to be not being spent on, or simply just more debt is being accrued.
I was looking at general sports betting all year, and between 2020 and 2025, which is not that much time, it went from about 25 billion to 150 billion, which is a 6x increase. I wonder, I mean, you talked about the Super Bowl. What do you think in terms of like the ripple effects for the country when you see those kinds of increases over this like really short period of time? We're not talking about like 50 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's the fastest in the last 80 years in gambling. It's the fastest increase in one particular form of gambling we've ever seen, even faster than when slot machines were invented or the first generation of online, betting. But again, where does it end? And I think from a public health standpoint, it goes back to a few things. As we expand more opportunities to gamble, and we will, and it's just going to get faster and faster and smarter
Yeah.
and smarter and riskier and more enticing and more enticing. There is concern that we drive up the rate of gambling addiction by 1 or 2%, which would be, essentially an epidemic.
Yeah.
On the flip side, again, I go back to I want to hear more about people's stories and their lives that are made better because of these products that are out there. Yes, there are more jobs. Yes, there's more potential tax revenue and bases in certain states, but not all.
Hmm.
That number you highlighted is regulated gambling. There's, again, another
Right.
disproportionate number of unregulated gambling that we have no idea how much money is truly being spent there and where that money goes. So you put it all together, we know that humans love betting on things. They love sports. They love getting rewards. We know that. The real question is, how do we contain it in a way so that we don't see problems grow and grow and grow? And again, measurable problems, gambling addiction rates, bankruptcies,
Right.
measures of stalled life development, right? Like decreased home ownership, increased
Right.
debt. These are the things that we can measure. Suicides, divorce rates, all those things that come from from financial pain. So I divided that very simply. Gambling and financially related products do create financial pain. If that financial pain is too much, that's going to spread into physical and emotional pain, and then obviously the byproducts of that could be, really enormous.
And do you see those things, those negative indications increasing?
And again, it's harder to measure. It's not like opiates where we can measure clearly, how many deaths from opioid overdoses. But again, when we
Right.
look at nationally things that we see from the mental health world, we see suicides going up. We see rates of depression and people seeking help for mental illnesses going up. We see,
Mhm.
again, calls to the helpline for gambling going up. We see demand for just treatment going up there as well. So these are the signals that we're looking at. I don't have the bankruptcy number, the divorce rates, but, then I'll see stories about great divorces. And the first thing I always wonder is, well, was gambling part of that? So I think there's a lot of things that happen in society, and oftentimes gambling might not be tied to right away.
To what degree do you feel like this issue of loneliness and phones is connected to other things where loneliness and phones have been talked about, like, the ubiquity of social media and the idea that, every time you check, could be like your email or it could be TikTok, like you get this little hit.
Right.
To what degree do you feel like these things are all tied together, or they're part of like a way in which America has changed?
It's a fascinating area, and I think it's definitely tied in. I think your last episode talked a lot about, men are struggling, right? And you talked a lot
Yes.
about this is exactly right. And we start with number one, what is just loneliness, right? A sense of
Right.
inadequate connection to others. So you can be physically
Right.
around tons of people, but still feel inadequate, like you're not really talking.
Right.
So it's more than just loneliness. It's also not communicating in real life. It's just not dealing with the whole range of emotional feelings, from sadness, rejection, anxiety, fear, and all of that. But a lot of it goes back to just simply the phone itself giving us all the forms of entertainment you would possibly be interested in at really high speeds. That's the key. At really high speeds with no kind of sense of rejection or, betrayal. But it's also the people who put the stuff on the phone that drive attention or drive inattention. I think about, again, my own life, and sometimes I'll tell stories to our kids or to medical students. You know what it was like in the 80s to hang around listening to records in basements and playing ping pong, and they'd be like, that
Yeah.
sounds really boring. And then I said, well, then I think about what would it be like in 1880s to be sitting
Right.
around by candlelight, listening to somebody tell a story or maybe read a book that one person has. So times have
Right.
shift dramatically. I think what's unique about the phone as I think about it, it's the one thing that has no end to it. It's the one thing that can captivate our attention forever, and you would never have to
Right.
go talk to another person. So that's why it sounds a little
Right.
bit scary. But that's why when you go back to gambling and online financial things, these are things that are in many respects easier done in solitude than in together. None of my patients have ever gotten into trouble by being in a betting syndicate or an investment club. They've always just done it on
Hmm.
their own. And I think
Right.
that's a
Right.
hugely important part when we're thinking about the role of these apps, in future
Right.
society.
Right. I want to ask you a little bit about the public health issue and whether you think state officials, national officials have on their radar what you do, which is like, whoa, issue problem gambling is way more of an issue than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And I'll tie that in with a lot of states have legalized like forms of gambling and now rely on it for their tax base. I noticed the National Conference of State Legislatures said Maryland lawmakers increased the tax rate on mobile sports betting from 20% to from 15% to help close a budget gap. Meanwhile, Louisiana raised its online sports wagering to 21.5% from 15% to create a fund for student athletes. So, like, you have states that maybe should be looking out for the public health consequences, but kind of maybe need this money.
You know, if you and I were governor and we were having these talks, they're not easy. You go back to
Yeah.
how much revenue is generated by alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. It's a big chunk. But you also look at
Yeah.
every single state, they outspend gambling prevention by, hundreds and folds. You look at, for instance, here in the state of California, our alcohol, tobacco budgets for handling prevention, education, treatment, it's like $600-700 million, right? When it comes to gambling, it's around 9 million. So it's much, much smaller. There is no federal agency that handles this. There is no
Okay.
federal division. We have NIH and NIDA and NIAAA, but we don't have a space. We have SAMHSA. We don't have a space where gambling behaviors really fall under the rubric of the feds. And then again, as you said, these are revenue generators. It is highly
Right.
unpopular to raise taxes unless you're in California, right? And no one wants that. And for years, I never understood why do we link the lottery with schools? Because they don't have anything to do with each other. And it was
Right.
done initially as a way to assuage people's guilt about spending money on the lottery. So imagine a
I
time
see.
back in the 70s and 80s when the lottery itself was controversial. When it was like, oh my
Right.
gosh, we're going to allow that. And next thing you know,
Right.
the fabric of society is going to collapse. And literally, that's what people would think. Now people think of the
Right.
lottery as what? Antiquated, and older.
Right.
It's for old folks, even though the jackpots are $1 billion. But I think
Right.
so. The bottom line of what we've always called for is, partnerships and transparency. So in other words, for state that generate revenue, say you need to keep a portion aside to protect the ones who are most vulnerable in your state from developing problems. That's not
Right.
an issue where these people choose it. These are just people who are biologically, psychologically, and socially vulnerable to gambling addiction through no fault of their own. That's how I view it.
But are state governments and the federal government, are they doing that? Are they
Some
protecting
are, but
people?
it's to a very small degree. So again, like here in
Okay.
California, we're talking about a $9 million a year budget. In the
And there's like, I think maybe 40 plus million people live in California,
there
right?
are, and we generate over $17 billion in gambling revenues in California
Right.
legally. So we're talking
Okay.
about not nearly enough resources spent. But the larger question we always get is they say, well, who should be responsible? And for years, people would say, well, if you develop gambling harm, that's on you. That's on you. That's a you problem. And that's kind of
Right.
how we used to think about drugs and alcohol. Now we're saying, no, it's not, at least what we're saying in our field of addiction, it's not a you problem, it's a we
Right.
problem. So you may have biological or psychological risks, but we created an environment that takes advantage of those risks. We allowed business companies to put out products that really pull out those vulnerabilities quickly because their products are highly addictive, highly engaging, right? So it really should be a shared responsibility. But a lot of legislators will say, it's interesting, you know what, you're right, that's a topic we should get into, but my constituents aren't asking me to do that. So that's not something I'm going to go to the Hill and say this is my thing. When we got potholes to fill, homelessness, we got income inequality, right? So it's not something that's yet reached the level. But however, I think through the media and through discussions like this that get out into the public, that's when we're going to start to get people just talking about it. I just came back from a conference recently where it was revealed that the governor of Ohio, who authorized and legalized sports betting, now has publicly stated he wish he never had. because
Mhm.
of the public health damage and things that came
Mhm.
out that he never thought and foresaw, addiction and
Right.
expenditures and distractions and not a lot of jobs, created physical jobs. So I thought that was incredibly honest and earnest for a politician to actually say publicly, you know what, I think this was a mistake. So long short of it, again, I think we all need to take a look at what our in the mirror about our own relationships with gambling, what we think about it, and how we view it should be out there. And I think that's super important moving forward.
Talk for a minute about the effect on families, that the family members who don't do the gambling, but are in the family
Yeah.
with the person. When you say sort of like, "Oh, well, if you gamble, like, kinda like that's your problem."
Right.
I'm guessing as a physician, you've seen something different, which is like, actually, it's probably more than your problem.
Right. Yeah, and that's the scourge of all addictions, right? Is that it touches so many different lives. And there's been a number of studies that point out for every one person with a gambling disorder really adversely affects about 8 to 9 people around them in really negative ways. So the
Right.
others
Wow.
around them suffer from depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, stalled life development, things like that. But again, the laundry list is long, but it's going to be things that shock you, like domestic violence rates, higher divorce rates, just relationship conflicts, the impact on the affected person or affected other or affected individual. Usually it's going to be a spouse or partner, but oftentimes it's a child or a parent.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a neighbor, sometimes it's a friend. It's profound. It's things like, oh my gosh, loss of trust. How do I handle the finances? What do I do if the IRS or collectors come a calling? There's a lot of anxiety to say, wow, he or she there must be something wrong with me because they're choosing to do
Right.
that instead
Right.
of spending time with me. There's a lot of, well,
Right.
how do I confront them, particularly if I, as an affected other, is not very well versed in how the money works or the finances go. So like any other addiction, the consequences can be extreme, but I think that is an area of neglect for a lot of folks. They think it's just the gambler. No, it's everyone around the gambler. And they forget, oftentimes what happens, paradoxically, sometimes when the gambler wins, they pay for things. They buy things, they buy nice gifts, they buy,
I see. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
clothes and all of that. So it creates for the
Right.
affected others a really bizarre, twisted experience. I had one time where a patient of mine had relapsed, and he actually ended up winning like $100,000 jackpot at a casino. And he was so excited. He was so, like, it's all my problems. He came home, he showed his wife the big fat check, and she just started crying because she's like, oh my gosh, now he's going to keep doing it. And now all he's going to
Right.
talk about is wanting to spend this money on things that we don't need. So, it just has a way of bringing out a lot of conflict and stress for folks. And I think for anyone listening, you think about like, well, what do I do? What do I
Right.
say? I think it's important to be honest and say, I'm concerned that your gambling is creating these activities or these behaviors that make me anxious or make me scared. A lot of I statements
Mm-hmm.
is a good start. Or frankly, we tell a lot of families to go seek professional help first and understand more about this condition. About 40% of the calls to all the gambling helplines are from family members or not from the gambler
Mm-hmm.
themselves. And it's the usual story. Oh, I just discovered this account is a zero, or I just discovered a credit
Right.
card bill,
Right.
or he's never home and I put a location and I thought he was cheating on me, but he's going to the casino. But
Uh-huh.
now I don't hear those stories anymore because they don't go to the casino, they go to the bathroom.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's always on his phone. I don't know what he's
Yeah.
doing. That tends to be the more
Right.
common one
Right.
nowadays.
Let me ask you quickly about, you've talked about gambling with Asian Americans, and I don't know, if casinos or companies target groups of people specifically. Used to live not very far from Chinatown in Boston, and what really struck me was how much advertising there was for casinos. I mean, but the advertising was in Chinese. They would have like beauty pageants and song contests, like in Chinese at the casino. They would have buses that left, I think, every day, and I just wonder, are there certain groups that are targeted, or is this like ubiquitous? What's going on?
So that's a whole story in itself, but the short answer is absolutely yes. And so again, this is a business,
Huh.
and the business appeals
Yeah.
to its customer base. And for years, when we were doing this work with the Asian community, the question really was, wait a minute, are the casinos manufacturing the demand for this by aggressively going into communities, or are there cultural factors that are being brought out from that community looking
Right.
for the casino, demanding the casino? It's a little bit of both. And so we basically uncovered, when we talk about Asian Americans, predominantly we're talking about Chinese, Korean,
Mhm.
Filipinos, the Vietnamese, the large population. And again, there's like 30 different types of Asian Americans. But we see that, and we
Right.
see that it's a bit uncomfortable, right? Where there's some members of the community very much like it because it's a way of engaging the community, getting the community to do activities that they accept and promote and
Mhm.
like. But there's also
Mhm.
still members inside a community that feel, no, this is really predatory. This is, quote, keeping us down. This is, just another way of extracting money from immigrant population. So the story is much, much more complex. We've identified there are certain communities, Asian communities, where the rate of gambling addiction is much higher than you'd expect. 25, 30% of Chinatowns in San Francisco, for instance, one year was found to meet criteria for gambling disorder. So again, it goes
Oh
back
my
to
gosh. That's a lot of people.
who should be held accountable. Because on one hand,
Yeah.
if that's what the community wants, that should be allowable. On the other hand, if it's
Right.
clear that a casino operator knew this was, quote, predatory and knew it was taking and creating damage, but they did it anyway, that's just not something we're going to stand for. A lot of the casino operative that I talked to said, well, we work hand in hand with the community. We go with what they're asking for. We're listening to their responses and their needs. And I say, well, what about, the Latino community, African-American communities, or other, we do those things as well. It just happens to be that tight-knit Asian communities tend to ask for these products, so much. There was one group I remember working with that was saying, well, even the casino buses shut down, the Chinatown travel agencies had their own casino buses that would just do it because, again, it was
Jeez.
demand from the community. So
Right. But when you talk about a community where if like 25% of people has some level of addictive behavior, and you think about the circle around people, like you were talking about how many people are affected, but that's like 100% of the people being
it's a
affected in
lot,
one way or
and that's
another.
partly why there's been a lot of concern to say, well, how come sometimes there hasn't been advancement economically or socially in
Yeah.
some immigrant populations? And again, addictions and mental health conditions tend to hold families back. I mean, imagine, an immigrant family coming in and, a couple $100,000 are earned and lost, and those opportunities for the next generation just aren't there. And that's
Right.
kind of what the story is in some communities, but not all. Not all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me where this goes from here. I mean, in some ways, I could imagine making the case for both Democrats and Republicans. Like, Democrats don't want a regressive tax that disproportionately hurts poor people. So I could imagine them being against gambling. Republicans often talk about like kind of family values and Christianity, and that would not really include gambling. But yet it seems to be completely rampant and not slowing down in its growth at all. What do you think, like, what does the future look like?
Well, that's if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, I never would have predicted these sorts of things on the internet at all. I wouldn't even know how to invent these things. So I'll say it very simply, the future is fuzzy. I think, one lane of concern is that if we don't do more prevention, education, treatment, and research, again, that rate of gambling addiction goes up. And if that rate goes up, more societal problems are incurred. If on another lane, we embrace gambling and really promote the very best aspects of it, invention, innovation, risk-taking, building new products, doing new things with it, strengthening financial health in some way or the other, then these are things that are fine. But the problem is we just don't know. And I think the byproduct, one area, for instance, that I have great concern on is the area of prediction markets and the way we monetize every choice that humans make. And so by doing that, you then create, everyone's no longer a person and just a commodity. recent news events, as we're recording this, whether it be, will this person, kidnapper, be found? Will the election be held? These are really morbid things to, quote, be betting on. And yet that's what's out there. So potentially you can see a much less compassionate society because they're only caring about the outcomes. Or worse, you see greater mistrust. We talk about income inequality. Well, one of the things that I'm concerned about is trust inequality. And so you imagine anything event that happens and it's tied into making money, whoever loses money is going to say what? It's rigged, it's fixed, it's someone knew something. So imagine like in recent events, there was a bit where the White House press secretary was doing a little presentation. She looked up at the clock and then she shuttled off. And immediately there was some chatter online saying, oh, she left the podium because there was a prediction market contract for that day. It's like, how long will she stay at that podium? 3 minutes or less.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
I can't believe that's a contract people bet on.
Went off stage, and then immediately there was online chatter. It's rigged. The fix is in. Somebody made a lot of money. Meaning, again, that will just create any sort of mistrust. Imagine a major news event, earthquake, tornado, another school shooting, and you have all these things tied in on the prediction marketplace. Someone is going to say, oh, that happened because of the prediction.
Because there was money. I mean, that already happens in sports, right? Did that happen? Did that pitch go that way because that person had engineered it that way?
Exactly. And so when you fast forward to what I'm concerned about, we already have major trust issues in just what we see and hear on the internet. I think when you tie that into money and commodities, we're going to have even more trust issues depending on the outcome.
Let me just drill down a little bit on something you said at the very beginning of that answer, which was if we focus on sort of the innovativeness of some of these gambling platforms. And I'm not sure if are you thinking, are there good aspects of the gambling platforms?
Again, it's kind of like war. What is it good for? Same thing I would argue, gambling and betting, investing, what is it good for? Where by human nature, we are risk-taking species. And the only way we advance and make inventions and innovations by taking risks. I think the concept of gambling isn't just on money; it's on other things. Do I take this job, or do I take that? Do I write this book? Do I write this other book? So that's why we have to emphasize is that this idea of learning how to take risks, learning how to balance loss, learning when a risk is too risky or when it's not. These are all skills that can easily be taught by games of chance, or by gambling apps, or by certain things inside there. I think the other thing there as well is that there's tremendous innovation in just technology, like the math of how these things get done, moving money from left to right, calculating odds in real time, building platforms that literally millions and millions of people can use, and it never crashes. When was the last time you heard about a gambling app crashing? When was the last time you heard?
But it sounds like that's pro-creator versus that it's not so much the gambler that you're amazed with, but it's the person who created the app.
But it's still related to the industry. And it's kind of why did we go to the moon?
Yeah.
We went to the moon and we created all these industries as a result of going to the moon. So this is just an optimistic view to say, well, as a result of expanding these various risky ventures, will we have other inventions and things that are good for mankind? Tang was invented, right? Because we went to the moon. Regardless of whether you drink Tang or not now, it was invented. So these are just observations from just a doctor. That's all I'm saying. By no means are they binding, but they're just things that I notice and see. And I think that it's definitely worthy of interest. And again, the gambling industry for years, brick and mortar, created millions of jobs. Because you had to, that's, I think, we're not talking about enough. And I don't have that answer. What kind of wages and jobs are created by these gambling apps? How many humans are now employed because of this invention we've created? So just a few random thoughts.
Timothy Fong is the co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies Program. He's also a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA. Tim, thanks so much. This was great. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having us. And for anyone curious about their gambling or concerned about their gambling or someone else's, they can simply call 1-800-GAMBLER. That'll get you through to a professional locally, or you can take a look at our website, UCLAGamblingProgram.org. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks to you for joining us. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more interviews like this. And Tim Fong actually mentioned the interview that we recently did with Richard Reeves, in which he talked about why many boys and men in America have fallen behind. And of course, a huge piece of that, as we discussed here, is this issue of loneliness and isolation. In our show notes for this week, we've got more on gambling from the journalist resource at Harvard's Shorenstein Center. And what they've done is they've put together 5 graphs that give you a sense of how sports betting has grown in the U.S. And I'll give you a little insight into just one of those graphs, which is how much of state revenue does your state get from sports betting? And I'll tell you, in the lead are Montana, New Hampshire, and New York. So that's in the show notes for this week's show. Thanks very much to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for their generous support. Thanks also to producer Matt Purdy, and I'll talk to you next time.